All right. The net number's been stable for a little bit, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. So for those of you who are joining us, welcome. I am the Tina Greco Caleb. I am the co-chair for the Student and Postdoc Mentoring Committee through the American Auditory Society. And today I'm very excited to introduce our two speakers, Dr. Angie Garinis and Dr. Ed Rubel. We're planning to have a hopefully very dynamic session today. I think we do have time from now until about 3:30. So we're hoping everyone can stay for that amount of time. But if you need to jump off early, that's not a problem. And like I said, the hope is that we'll have a dynamic session. So I encourage you to kind of locate the Q&A tab on the Teams window. And so I'll be tracking the questions and the answers throughout the session, or the questions throughout the session, and trying to keep things moving along. So before we do jump into it, I would like to introduce our two speakers more formally. So Dr. Garinis is an associate professor at the Oregon Health and Science University. As the only PhD audiologist at OHSU, she has the opportunity to mentor various students or trainees, including medical residents, AD students, and students going through the LEND program. She also has been involved in the Building Exito, am I saying it correctly, Angie? Program, which aims to develop and implement research training models for undergraduates who have historically been underrepresented in biomedical research careers. Dr. Ed Rubel, I feel like you don't need really any introduction. You are a professor emeritus at the University of Washington. He has been mentoring for several decades and also mentoring students at various levels. This includes graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, residents, MD, PhD candidates, as well as junior faculty. And in addition to their respective roles as mentor and mentees throughout their careers, Dr. Garinis and Dr. Rubel are research collaborators. So they themselves have a dynamic, and I'm sure we'll be seeing that throughout today's workshop. So in sort of preparation for this workshop, I've had a couple of opportunities to talk with both of them. And I've learned about their path both to and through academia and their experiences as both being mentored as well as mentoring trainees. And as we've discussed, it's not really an easy path to find the right mentor. And I think this sentiment it really resonates with many of you because of the questions that you submitted when you registered to attend this workshop. So we're going to start there. And then again, we'll see how the discussion evolves. Please, again, feel free to use the Q&A to submit additional questions or comments based on our conversation, and I'll be tracking them. But without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Rubel and Dr. Garinis with the first question, which is, how do you find the right mentor?
Okay. Let me start. Thank you, Tina, and Darla and Angie for putting up with me. And I will apologize to the audience right now that I do have COVID right now. Unfortunately, I picked it up on a trip to Utah last weekend, and no, weekend before this last weekend. And so if I turn away and cough once in a while, please excuse me. But Teams has told me it's not contagious over their network. So that let's get started. I think we can start by a few things about how to find the right mentor. First of all, there's some things about mentors that most mentors don't appreciate right away, and that is that your success as a scientist and as an academic depends on your success as a mentor. If you're attracting good people to your lab or your classes, they're going to be successful, and if you treat them well, they're going to be successful. And there's one secret for being a good mentor. And if you can't do that secret, then don't be a mentor, in my opinion. And that is, it's about them. It's about the mentee. It's not about your career. It's about promoting their ability to find information and advance in their career. And the more you help with that, the more good people will come to your lab, and you'll be able to build a team, and that team can last the rest of your career as it matures and as it changes. So everything you do has to be about them. And there are things that you might not want to do. You might not want to give the credit to them because you, quote, thought of the idea. No, they get the credit. And if they get more credit than they deserve, you're doing your job. Okay? Because they're going to be promoted, they're going to go on to do things, and they're going to go on to treat their mentees well. So I think that's the thing you have to do. You have to be available. You have to give credit. Sometimes you have to take the hit, okay, that you made that mistake and not get after them for making a mistake. It all depends on the situation. And also, you have to remember that not all mentees are the same. Everyone is different. Everyone needs different kinds of handling. I sent something to most of my mentees asking what I did right and what I did wrong. And about half of them said the thing I did right is I was always available. And the other half said the thing I did right was to leave them alone to do their research. Okay? So it's all about what does that mentee need? Uh, so, Angie, you want to go on?
Sure. Thanks, Ed. Um, it sounds like a straightforward question, but it's actually a really loaded question. So how do you find a good mentor? And when I think back to my early schooling and early career, I had no idea what I was looking for in a mentor. And so I think the most important thing for the mentee is to sit and think about what their goals are. So, for those of us that are both clinicians and scientists, your goals are really dependent on your stage in life at that time. So, if my stage is to be a really, really good clinician and to work well with patients and learn how to listen to patients, then I'm going to work with a mentor who will be able to guide me in that realm. If your goal is to be a really good scientist, then, and you have your goals clear on the type of research that you want to do, then you'll look for someone who's not just an expert in that area. And I think, Ed, you really nailed it, because early on, I didn't think about, I would look for someone who was really an expert in the content, but not necessarily a great person to work with, or someone who I had a good relationship with where I could actually meet my goals and get things done efficiently. So it's really kind of, there's multiple layers to identifying the mentor that will work with you. And part of it is their expertise, and the other part of it is kind of a relationship. So, who do you work well with, and what are you looking for in that person? And so, and I can give examples. I don't want to take too much time to do that, but I can give examples throughout my career for how that would work. One thing I'd like to quickly say, so during my PhD, it was really, I was of that year, to age myself, where you could get a clinical master's in audiology and do your CFY, or you could choose to do this new AUD program, which was scary. We didn't know what it entailed. And I had decided during my CFY year to start my PhD. So I didn't do an AUD. I actually don't have an AUD. And I've thought about going back, but I'm getting to mid-career where I feel lazy about going back to school now. So during my first year of the PhD, I was very lucky to fall into a mentorship role with Dr. Barbara Cohn and Ted Glackey. But I didn't necessarily select them based on my research goals at that time. It worked. And once I graduated, finished my PhD, and was looking for a postdoc mentor, and this is how Ed and I are related, I started to interview different mentors around the country who had interest in hiring someone in their lab. And when I went to Seattle and I met Dr. Lynn Werner, I remember, and I won't forget this, that she actually asked me what I wanted to do, and that she really wanted me to do my own work. And so I thought that was really empowering and scary, but it really gave me some independence to go ahead and lead into my postdoc. And I'll tell you, she was a mentee of Ed Rubel's, and she learned that from his mentorship. So we're kind of related.
I think you hit it on the head. And but I think that when you're choosing a mentor and you have choices at the institution you're at, there are some things you have to do. Okay. Remember, we start out, okay, and our first mentors we didn't choose. Okay, they're our parents, and they didn't choose us. Okay, but they thought they had to mentor us in everything, and we thought they were mentoring us in everything. But then we became more selective, and as you grow older, your positions change and so forth. We have mentors for every part of our career. Okay, there's not just one mentor, but often the graduate school mentor is the first real mentor that a person chooses. And then the question is, how do you go about it? Well, you have to find out what the options are at the institution you're at. And if there's only one option at the institution you're at, you probably ought to find a different institution, in my opinion. The other thing you have to do is you have to do your homework. You have to find out what that person does in detail. That's pretty easy if it's research. Excuse me. And then you have to interview previous mentees from that person, because that person may tell you their mentoring style, but we all lie. We all lie and we all say, well, anybody can work with me. Well, that's never true. So you have to find out, you have to talk to people that are being mentored. And the best thing is to contact people that have been mentored and ask them, what's the group like? Is there a team, or is everybody working alone? And so forth. And neither of those are bad. Some mentors like to have everybody doing their own thing, and they communicate when necessary, but not. Others are like me, and I had a lab meeting every single week. And if somebody didn't show up for that lab meeting, they, had to tell me whose funeral they were at. And one person said he didn't show up because had to go to the Apple store and buy a new watch. I mean, buy a new phone. And I said, well, then just don't come back. And so, yeah, I'm a hard ass in certain ways. I expect a person to show up for group meetings. There are some people that have somebody write something every week. And for new trainees, that might be a good idea. So you really need to do your homework and find out what the mentoring style of a person is and whether people were happy there.
Right. And I know we have other questions, and I just want to end really quick with make sure not to put all of your eggs in one basket. I've had multiple mentors at the same stage of my career for different reasons, and that's really important. So,
and let me add to that. Don't expect this person to be your personal mentor, the mentor for your personal life. Find somebody else, please.
So actually, Angie, your last point, I think kind of extends to this other idea. So I think we've been talking a lot about having a local mentor or mentee, right? You're working in someone's lab, but there were some questions about mentoring mentors outside of your institution, or maybe mentors who are doing the type of work that you want to do. Do you have any recommendations for connecting with mentors that maybe aren't in your local community, but mentors who may be able to provide support, long distance?
Yeah, Ed, if you don't mind, I can go ahead and start with this one. I have a great story that I love to tell people. So probably about 10 years ago when I started doing my ototoxicity research in cystic fibrosis. And that was a complete shift for me because most of my research was in the area of auditory development and auditory psychophysics, working in Dr. Lynn Werner's lab. And I had this opportunity to work on a research project that Doctors Keith, Lisa Hunter, and Pat Feeney were PIs on, which led me to the Cystic Fibrosis Center. And during that time, what we were trying to do is we were trying to advocate for ototoxicity monitoring because less than 1% of patients had any type of hearing test or balance assessment. And so in the first couple of years, working kind of as a research associate on that grant, I thought about writing a grant for the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation that was advocating for ototoxicity, but they had never funded a project in that area. And so I cold emailed someone who was at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. I just happened to be out there for medical reasons for a family member. And I asked that individual if they'd be willing to meet for coffee to talk more about this. And this individual's name was Dr. Ronald Rubenstein. He was the director of the Cystic Fibrosis Center at CHOP at that time and had also been on the board at CFF. And so he had knowledge about the clinical research grants that may or may not be funded. And so emailing someone that is outside of your institution that you don't know can be kind of anxiety provoking because you're unsure of how this person's going to respond to let's get a cup of coffee. But I'll tell you, it changed the course of my career. The reason is that I had no idea that Dr. Rubenstein actually was born with pretty significant hearing loss and had been advocating for ototoxicity monitoring and the reduction of aminoglycosides as a primary treatment in CF for years. And so we teamed up and we actually wrote that CFF grant and we received a very high score and have now been working on that project for about 4 years. So when I say that, I think part of finding mentors and others to collaborate with outside of your institution does take a little bit of guts to reach out to them and really have them acknowledge, have confidence in you in the sense that you have, that you can be a good collaborator, or you're a mentee that will actually be effective in doing the work that they want to do or that you want to do, and that they're not wasting their time. And that was a big thing that Dr. Rubenstein said to me, is that many people have reached out to him via email that he's ignored. And so he wants to make sure he's putting time into someone that he thinks is actually going to make a change and is actually going to make a difference and that was serious. And so I think that, those are kind of the key components of take the risk. And then the other kind of suggestions we put about a mentor relationship also plays a role in your outside collaborations and relationships in your field. So make sure they're easy to work with or that you feel like you can communicate with them well. All of those things play a role in your success. And Ed, do you want to?
Yeah, I just add to that Angie was at a relatively advanced stage in her career and her training when she did this, and it worked out great. But I'd caution people not to go around their primary mentor, particularly at an early stage in your career. As you start with some primary mentor and you build a relationship, that relationship is based on trust and open communication. And if you're asking for advice or stuff from somebody in the field, that's great, and it's always great. But you probably, particularly when you're starting out, want to inform your research mentor that you're going to do that or that you'd like to do that. And if most people would say, "Hey, go for it," and but you do want to be careful to keep the communication channels wide open.
Yeah, that's very good advice, Ed.
Awesome.
So,
go ahead.
No, go.
Okay. So I think one of the themes in among the questions that were submitted, and I want to make sure we dedicate enough time to this because it definitely came up over and over. So I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit. And so you're already in a mentor-mentee relationship, and there were not all relationships are smooth sailing. So there was sort of this general theme of how do you navigate a difficult mentor-mentee relationship, and included in that is the power dynamic, um, having difficult conversations, and that could be both the mentor needing to have a difficult conversation with the mentee or vice versa, and really just navigating different personalities. Again, I know this also seems like a loaded question, so let's maybe if we can just get into it for a little bit and see where it goes. And again, I encourage if anyone has any follow-up questions or comments, please don't hesitate to put them into the Q&A.
Yeah, I could just briefly say, as someone who is completely opposite of an introvert, it's still hard to maintain open communication and honesty. And that, I think, even if you have a difficult relationship with your mentor-mentee, a collaborator, if you maintain that rather than build resentment, it will help move you through those situations. And that is the hardest thing that people can really do. Most of the, I would say, kind of rocky situations that I've had in my career and also as a student were because of that lack of communication. So that is just one key piece. I have other things, but I know Ed had something to say.
Yeah, I think this is a really important thing, and that is establishing open, honest communication at the very beginning of your relationship and staying with it. Not not having that first moment where you're wondering go by without talking about it. Okay. Uh, my favorite story about this is Brenda Riles. Now, most of you know who Brenda Riles is. She's been very active in this organization and was for many years editor of the journal. Brenda came into my lab, uh, and I could call her a sweet young lady from the South. And I'm a not so sweet older man from the South, but I was early in my career at that time. And Brenda, was right after I moved to Virginia, and Brenda came and asked if she could work in a lab. And we started doing some work together. And at one point, she came in my office and she was quite upset. And she said, "Nobody's ever yelled at me before." And I said, "Brenda, I didn't yell at you. I just spoke sharply about what I thought you had done mistakenly in the lab." And she said, "Yeah, that's yelling." And I said, "Okay, we have a deal. Okay, I won't yell at you ever again, and I apologize." And Brenda and I have been very close friends for now about 50 years. And it was open communication. I learned something about myself, and she learned something about me, and that, if anything, made our relationship better. So, getting these things off the chest. And if you get them off the chest and it doesn't work, and you find it doesn't work twice or three times, you need to find a new mentor, because it's not going to be a good relationship, and it's not a relationship that you're going to learn to be a mentor from, unless you're learning and feel you have to learn things the hard way. So I think it's a communication thing, as Angie said, and being part of a team. I've also found, because my lab was sort of a big team, that the other people in my lab were able to often offset uh, these kind of problems by warning one of us that we had probably done something that was a miscalculation. Okay. And the people in the lab would, a new mentee, they would talk to that person and say, okay, that's not what we do in this lab. For example, in a lab meeting, we never criticize a person, but we always criticize ideas. And that's open territory on ideas, but not open territory on people. And people learn that very, very quickly.
And I have to say, you touched on something I think that's really important. So, one thing about working with others is you learn about their social and cultural sensitivities. I
Yeah.
can definitely relate to, my husband's family is from the South, and my family is from the South side of Chicago, and we're Greek immigrants. And so when we talk, it does sound like yelling, but we're just planning our dinner. And
Yeah.
so, so I think that that's another important thing about listening to the people that you're working with and understanding, that there may be some cultural differences that you interpret one way, but it's not really the way they meant it. So again, coming back to that, open communication is key. Something else I think we were kind of alluding to, but we didn't mention, is expectations. I also found that when I think back to some of the conflicts or, some of the rocky times, with other mentors that I worked with, part of it is they had different expectations than I had during the time I was working with them. And we never established those early on. And so in their mind, they may be thinking, well, I thought data collection was going to be done in the next 3 weeks. But in my mind, I'm thinking we have a deadline in 4 months. So it's really important that you establish your expectations as well as your mentors early on, and maybe have a way to write it down and have a checklist so that if anything comes up, even if your mentor had a different expectation, you have something to come back to. Um, so yeah, so two key components: open communication and set expectations. Is there something we missed, Ed?
Yeah, I think one thing you missed is that what we try and do in a laboratory or in any kind of group setting is build a community. Okay. And that community is really, really important. And it takes care of a lot of these things if there's a community. Uh, my lab, we had a lab meeting every week. We had a group dinner at ARO that we still have for all the people that went through that lab. Okay. We had, at some points, we had a meeting with each, or I had a meeting with each student every week to go over results. And then I'd stop that for a while. Changing the expectations actually helps sometimes. But it was a community, and it was a community that played together. We had a retreat most years out at the mountains, and where people would give short synopses of their research, and people from outside, former members, would come and do that. So there was a whole community feeling, and that community took care of a lot of those things. And sometimes people in the community would do things to patch up little quibbles.
Yeah, I think sometimes as a mentor and for many trainees, I do learn from them as much as maybe they learn from me in different ways. So,
Yeah.
you know.
I love your focus on open communication and setting expectations and building a community. I think one theme that came across is even if you have those things, right? Sometimes you have to talk about difficult topics, and whether it is the mentor needs to have a difficult conversation with the mentee about their performance, or them not meeting maybe expectations, or a mentee may have to have a difficult conversation with their mentor about what they need, or maybe moving to a different focus. So do you have any suggestions or strategies on how to even approach a difficult conversation, right? So you know that you have to have that open communication, but sometimes it's really daunting. So any strategies or advice I think would be welcome.
I would suggest that mentees talk to their fellow mentees about how to approach that with that particular mentor. If possible, if it's not embarrassing. But other than that, I think you just got to uh, do it, and a good mentor has the door open for those things at all times. But let's remember that this is a professional relationship that requires personal honesty and things like that. But we're not trying to train a person, either a mentee or train a mentor in life. Okay. And if you have a problem with how that person lives their life, okay, you are welcome to say to that person, okay, please don't do that around me. Okay. I had one student. Okay, I come from a huggy family. Okay, lots of people don't come from huggy families. And I had a student said to me once, "I don't hug." And I said, "Got it." And to this day, I don't hug Karen Kennedy. Okay, who worked with me 30 years ago. It's easy, really.
Yeah, I mean, to follow up on that, I would say, so I've had to practice because sometimes, I feel like if there is something that I want to address, I just want to go in and say it and talk about it, get it over with. But for certain, I think situations, it's good to make sure that you have time with that individual to talk things through.
Yep.
Don't just stop by their office when they have 10 minutes before their next meeting. I would say make an appointment, and also sometimes practice with someone that you trust, especially if it's a really sensitive topic, just so you can figure out a good way that you feel comfortable relaying that information. And sometimes people are going to get offended on how you say things. If it's something, if you're too abrupt, or if it sounds like it's just a negative. So make sure that you're relaying what you want to say, but do it in a way that will have kind of an effective outcome. So I do think that thinking it through before you just go in hot is important, especially for sensitive topics. Now, for others, the bottom line, as Ed said, there's no way around it. You have to address it with your mentor. Otherwise, people end up having resentment and they move on to different labs, and it
Yeah.
never gets addressed, and that's not fun either.
And
So
that's not good for the mentor either, because that mentor has to learn to be a better and more versatile mentor if they're going to be successful.
yeah, I would say, a lot of trainees, and even ones that I was not their primary mentor, sometimes have come and asked me advice because they feel, for example, taken advantage of. So, and that's a really serious thing. As a mentee, if you feel like you're not being appreciated or you're being taken advantage of in a lab or in a clinical situation, that is something that needs to be addressed.
Yeah.
And that mentor maybe and probably didn't mean it. And they didn't realize that was happening until you actually let them know. So, I feel like the common theme is always open communication, but there definitely is a way to approach things in a more positive strategy for how you're saying it, especially if it comes to sensitive topics.
Also, you can have situations where a mentee is coming to you about something that's not in your realm of mentorship. And a good situation there is, or a good idea there is to, yeah, you can talk to the mentee about that, but put it, use a different location. Separate yourself out. I had a mentee, a resident who really had big problems with the clinical staff in the department, okay, the otolaryngology staff. And she felt terribly mistreated. And I said, Karen, why don't you come over Sunday morning and let's have coffee at my house and talk about this? And that just was such a relief to her to do it as a personal thing, okay, and not try and, fit it into our role, our typical role as a science mentor and mentee. Uh, and it worked, okay. Uh,
And yeah, and I'll tell you, even, being kind of mid-career stage, I still have 2 or 3 people that I rely on heavily for advice. And don't ever hesitate, I think, to reach out to those people when you get yourself in a situation that you're like, I know a change needs to be made in this relationship, and I have to address it, and I don't know how. I think it's important to get that advice also, and feel free that you have others you can rely on for it.
Awesome. So there was a question regarding, this would be kind of from the perspective of new faculty who are likely have established mentor-mentee relationships from the perspective of a mentee, but now they're beginning to take on the role of the mentor. What recommendations do you have for them, particularly as it relates to avoiding some of these issues that I think we've been kind of talking about already, just to make sure that they start off on a good foot and develop within that mentor role?
I think Ed might be coughing, but I can start off and say that I've learned the hard way multiple times to learn how to set boundaries. Especially as a new faculty member, I think that you're going to have, it will feel overwhelming depending on your curriculum schedule. Are you teaching 3 classes? Do you have to run a research lab? Do you have 30 students emailing you at the time? You have to set boundaries. I mean, I had a situation where the same student would email me twice a day about a different issue continuously. And I always wanted to have an open door kind of policy where I would be there for them. But at some point, you realize that you're not going to solve all their problems, right? So figuring out how to set boundaries for yourself is probably the key thing to keeping yourself sane and avoiding burnout.
I think new mentors really they have a role, they've had a role model, hopefully a good one. And they think that being a good mentor is using that same strategy that they were treated with for each of their students, each student that comes in. And it doesn't work, because the first thing to realize is that there are no easy strategies that will apply to all mentees. Every mentee is different, takes different kind of carrots, different kind of sticks to be a mentor for that trainee. So every one of them is a new situation. And your job as a mentor is to figure out what is useful for that person and what facilitates their research and career development. And it may be very different than any other student that you've had, and you got to think about it hard. There was a student who's now professor and chairman of a psychology department at a major university, that after she had been in the lab for 2 months, I said, why don't you just keep a record of what you did every hour, every day for 2 weeks? And she didn't take it badly. She said, okay. And when she did, okay, I said, you've watched 34 movies in 2 weeks. If you had watched half that many, maybe you would have gotten a little bit more work done. And she did. And she's gone on to have a great career. And she said that that was a turning point in her career, that this was not play anymore. It was her job. And it was my job to figure out how not to threaten her, but to help her realize that this was her job. Her job was to make data. And if she made data, she'd get the credit for that data. That's another question that comes up. If a faculty member doesn't give you credit for what you did, well, then that person is wrong, because the job of a mentor is to give credit and then more credit and more credit and facilitate the confidence in each mentee, and maybe not take as much credit for himself or herself, because you're building people, you're not building a product. And what your job is to build a scientist or an academician. So anyway, I think that's the big mistake, that they think one size fits all, and one size only fits one. And the next one comes along and it's a new challenge. Okay.
Awesome. Yes. This is really wonderful and sage words that I think you're sharing with us. So here's this next question is kind of a two-parter. And the first is that the topic is mentoring underrepresented students in PhD programs who have historically faced systemic barriers to academia. What strategies have you used or can you recommend to enhance the inclusivity and equity in mentoring relationships for that student population?
Angie, you want to go?
Sure. I think that's a great question. And I should also say that working at OHSU, we don't have an AUD or PhD program. So I have not actually had a PhD student. I have worked with quite a few AUD students. But the advice I'm going to give, I think, would probably relate to both. One thing that I've been trying to do as a mentor and also in my career is to take classes. So any classes that are offered by OHSU for me to better understand cultural sensitivities and other maybe social differences that I haven't necessarily been exposed to. I think that's really important, especially for mentors when you're choosing one, and for being able to continue the open line of communication with your student. And so as a PhD student entering kind of a new career, a new field where you already have high stress trying to get through your research and to complete your classes, it's important to see what is available at your institution in order to support you along the way. And don't hesitate to let your mentor know that there are opportunities for them to be able to learn more about you. I can't tell you how many times or how many programs that were actually available I was just not aware of. We have multiple DEI groups at OHSU. I knew about one of them, not all 5 of them. And so resources exist. And so, if they're not pursuing something, or you think that there's something that can help, let them know. And so I'll start there. I do have other things I don't want to take away from Ed, who has actually mentored PhD students in his career.
When I think about this question, I always go back to a person named Ed Ziegler. And Ed Ziegler was a colleague of mine at Yale when I was in psychology department, and he was a senior colleague, and he was picked by Nixon to be the leader of the first Office of Education, okay, and for the U.S. government. Okay, and Ed Ziegler went and did it. Why was he picked? Because Ed Ziegler did IQ tests on babies, and he found out that when you had a white person doing an IQ test on say a teenager, not a baby, or a 8-year-old or something like that, they got 1 score. And if you had a black person doing that same IQ test, they got a much better score. okay, 15 points better. In other words, the kid had his foot outside the door, okay? So what I learned from that is if I was in a situation that I couldn't handle or that I didn't think I could handle appropriately, get a co-mentor. I would have a co-mentor. And that worked several times, at least to get through the hard parts, okay? To build the trust and things like that. And that also happened with certain women that were in my lab. I wasn't communicating well, and I got another colleague to be a co-mentor. Okay, and that worked for me. I don't like taking classes. Okay, and so that's what worked for me. Uh, and and usually people are very delighted to help out in that way.
Yeah, and I would also say, I mean, I think so. Ed, both of us are first generation college students,
Yeah,
correct? Yeah,
yeah.
and so I know for in my PhD, I mean, again, my family was from Greece, and so we had some cultural differences. I wouldn't necessarily say we were a marginalized group, but it was hard for me to find others that understood why I would do things in the way I did because of my cultural upbringing. And I didn't really have a lot of Greeks in Arizona when I was going to school to be able to have a community. And so you create one. You find ways along with your mentor. And that's the key, though. I will say if your mentor is not open to doing that with you and they're putting it on you alone, then find another mentor because I think the best thing that you can do is actually have someone along the road, especially during your PhD, that supports you. It is really important because these are social justice issues, and there's definitely policies at your institution. There's definitely groups to help with many marginalized communities along the way. And so it's not just your role to find them. I think it's important for your mentor to actually support that too. And so, but yeah, so those are, I guess, some pieces of advice, and we're happy to maybe elaborate if
So
needed.
so what Angie is saying there is that really is an important thing that I think both of us believe is that each student is training a mentor. So each mentee is not only being mentored, but they're training their mentor. Okay. And the mentor has to be able to learn from the trainee. Okay, because each trainee of each good trainee that's been in my lab, it's not only changed my research, but they've uh, extended my mentorship ability because they taught me new things about, how to treat people and how to really get the to facilitate people's careers. And that's the job of a mentor. The job of a mentor isn't to get people to work in their lab. The job of a mentor is to get people to extend what they did in the lab and to become mentors themselves. So we're making people. We're not making a factory, a product. And we are becoming broader people, hopefully.
So I think
We are
this is
still
a
people.
okay, that's right. That's right. I think this is actually a nice segue. So there was a question about sort of, and I mean, Ed, you've definitely touched on this when you're talking about customizing your mentoring approach depending on the mentee. But there was a question about your approaches to doctoral students. And I guess under that, I might consider, AUD students, residents, postdocs, doctoral students, compared to undergraduate students who are really just kind of looking to gain research experience. How might you approach a student based on where they're at in terms of their experience and their prior research or lack of research experience?
Well, I can jump in a little bit here. I know that I have worked with undergrads and, again, as I said, mostly AUD students, but I do think the expectations can be different. I worked with a number of undergraduate students from Portland State University that were in the Build Exito program. And I'm not sure if others know about this program, but it's an NIH-funded program that is really there to help build community and to allow individuals from underrepresented areas to have experience in a medical research lab. And so it's a wonderful opportunity. I've had two students, they funded this program for a year, and you would have a certain amount of expectations and arrangement with that student in the lab to be able to figure out how to meet their goals as well as goals of the program. And so with that said, they're coming into the lab as undergraduates with zero experience in research, from knowing how to write, knowing how to collect data, knowing what data actually means. And so I absolutely have a different expectation for their learning process than I would a graduate student who maybe has already volunteered in a lab, who has read research papers, and who may even have some goals of their own in terms of conducting a study and writing up a project. So Ed, did you hear that question?
Yeah, I heard the question. I don't, I mean, I've had lots of undergraduates work in the lab, and some have caught the bug, as I say, and stayed for a few years. Okay, and some have changed their fields totally. I can give some examples, but I won't waste the time. But I think my expertise is trying to facilitate the training of people that have already made a commitment to the field and or made a professional commitment. Now, several of them have gone on to other things in their life. Some have become lawyers after they got their PhD. Some have become gone into industry and continued doing research. Some have gone on to other fields of research. Okay, all kinds of things. But the career training, all of them would say that the career training that they got was valuable. Okay, even if they didn't stay in academia or didn't stay in research. But in terms of undergraduates, we're giving them a snippet of experience, and for those that go on, great. Okay, and some of them now we've also had people come through the lab that have done a gap year afterwards and then gone on to graduate school or medical school. They're a little different because they're now working full time in the lab for at least a year, or in some cases, or in most cases, 2 years, because they want to get some bona fide research experience. So, again, each person is different, but the people that are coming in the lab to kind of do a project that's a small project and write it up, I have not been very successful with those people, I don't think. Okay.
I'm actually gonna, Ed, I'm gonna ask you a quick question, because one thing I'll say is, how would you look at an undergraduate working in your lab differently than a graduate student when it comes to accountability? Because in my mind, I will say that there may be different expectations for their research experience, but I hold everybody accountable for what they're supposed to be doing. And I think that's important. So if even the undergraduate that comes in, if their goal is to collect some data, get a little bit of observation, they need to be there at the times they're supposed to be there, just as much as that PhD student. And so accountability is really important when you're gaining any type of experience in the field, because it's not just your time, it's also the others that are there to support you.
I absolutely agree with you. Absolutely. They need to be there when they say they're going to be there. If they can't be there, then or if they had to go get their iPhone instead of being at a lab meeting, then they have to be accountable, and they have to be accountable for the validity of and reliability of their data. And yes, we can teach them that. But I think that's something they have to learn. But that's something that they should have learned before coming in the lab. Okay, too. But it does have to be monitored. Okay, I would say. Uh, but graduate students and postdocs. Now, the interesting difference is to me has been between having MDs come to work in the lab, okay, versus people that are doing PhD training. Because once a person has an MD and they have doing postdoc, they might not have done any research before, okay, but they know a lot about a lot of things, but they don't know a lot about collecting data. And they might not know very much about how a microscope works. Okay. And so, really, when an MD is coming into the lab, okay, say a resident, they're really like a first year graduate student. And some people treat them like a postdoc. And they're not like a postdoc at all, because a postdoc has already done serious research and had to back it up and so forth. So an MD, in terms of laboratory procedures and in terms of collecting data, is really like a first year postdoc. Okay, and most of the MDs that do 1 year of research and only 1 year of research get nothing out of it in terms of a research career. Okay, and they never do research again. Remember, the modal number of publications that scientists have is one. That's the mode. Okay. And so most people don't, they do a little research and then they say, this isn't for me. And that's true of university administrators too, by the way. Uh, so I think that uh, the senior graduate student is a very different person, or the PhD postdoc, than the person that has an MD. And you're really starting over with a person that has an MD and no research experience. And that's fine, because some of them do great and will continue to do great. Okay. But they're at a different stage of research training. Mike Johns, the person became uh, dean at Hopkins and then at Michigan, and then at Hopkins, was in the lab at Virginia. And he came in and I said, Mike, how much do you know about using a microscope? And he said, almost nothing. And he said, remember, you're the PhD. You were our teachers in medical school. We're scared of you. And that's true. Okay. And so they really need a different kind of coaching.
So it sort of collectively, it sounds like, regardless of the where the mentee is on their trajectory through academia, you really need to sort of figure out what skill sets they're bringing, and then meet
Yeah.
them where they are. I think really, really good advice. So
I wish I had said it that simply, Tina.
That's okay. That's all right. My job is to summarize. So this next question relates in a slight way, and that is as a mentor, particularly, well, I guess whether you're junior or middle career or senior, you have a lot of responsibilities that can include clinical responsibilities, research responsibilities, administrative duties. So how do you balance these different roles while maintaining effective mentoring relationships? Because I think, as we've been talking about, building that relationship takes time, but as the mentor, you are having to sort of allocate your time to do all these other things. So do you have any advice or strategies that you implement to try to maintain those personal relationships while also getting all of, being accountable for all the other things on your plate?
Yeah, it's tough to do. I will say, going back to the boundary comment that I made earlier, it is important even for yourself as the mentor to have those boundaries, because it's not really an 8 to 5 job when you have clinical obligations, when you have mentorship obligations, service, research. And so I think, you learn over time throughout your career what works and how to keep balance. Part of it is making sure that you can carve out time that you are like, this is my research time for the day, because your time for as a mentor doesn't fit within that block. I, again, always have an open door policy. Now, my mentees cannot call me at 1 o'clock in the morning by any means, but they know they can reach out if they ever need anything via cell or email if needed. So I think for my primary, not I think, but for my primary obligations of some teaching, some clinical and research, I have that more kind of in a block throughout my day outside of writing, which many of us in research do in the evenings. And so my mentor time there really is no limit to that. And so, Ed, I don't know how you've dealt with all those responsibilities, but I do still struggle with making sure I can balance them as well as having time for my family.
Yeah. Uh, I I took the chicken way out. I routinely dropped other responsibilities in favor of uh, running a lab is what I did. And when I was I've been when I started the Blodell Center, okay, I was working really hard on, building the center and so forth. Before that, I was had a job in the dean's office. I quit the job in the dean's office to start the Blodell Center, and I quit being director of the Blodell Center. Maybe I shouldn't have, but I quit being director of the Blodell Center because I really didn't want that much administrative work. I've turned down many, many administrative jobs because what I loved doing was running a lab, training future scientists, and uh, collecting what I thought was meaningful data. That was my passion, and I gave up those other kind of responsibilities. And remember, I started out my career as teaching in a psychology department and gave up that for a full-time research job. Uh, and because I didn't want to have that much teaching. Okay, two courses a semester. And so I took the chicken's way out, if you will. Okay. And focused on trying to build a group and keep a group and spew people out in the community, if you will.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say that, because you were able to focus on something and you were really good at it, right? And so, I mean, I think you hit another really key component is you have your core responsibilities in your job. So you
Yeah.
have to teach these classes, or you have to be in clinic these days, or you
Right.
have to have this amount of funding.
Right.
That
Right.
you have to do. A
Yeah.
lot of the things that we do are elective. Okay. And it's really hard to choose between what we want to do and what we have time to do.
Right.
Okay. So
Right.
I think that it's really important. I think Ed makes a good point that you pick the things that you can do well that are important for your job. And if you
Yeah.
don't have the time to do the rest, then learning how to say no is really important.
Yeah.
Because when you have mentees, it doesn't matter. That is a priority for you. Again, like, you don't fit that into a block in your day. I mean, maybe your meetings with them, you have it scheduled, but when they need help, it's your job to be open for that.
Yeah.
And so learn to, definitely, and it is hard as a new faculty member to say no when you're asked to
Absolutely.
review papers, to teach more classes. Maybe you can be a committee head for this. And in the end, it doesn't serve you well or anyone else if you're burdened. So
Yeah, and you do have other responsibilities. Like I was on study section twice, and I, did those sort of things, and on NIDCD council, but those were things that you have responsibility to to your field and to the community and things like that. And you have to do those, okay? You can't be selfish about your time, but you can give up things. When my daughter was about, she was, I think, in junior high school, she got her hair cut. And she came home and she was really upset about her haircut and never be able to go to school again, never be able to see people again, and so forth. So I spent, 2.5 hours because I love my daughter and I still love that daughter. And I spent 2.5 hours convincing her that her hair would grow. Okay. And when was asked to be the permanent director of the Blodell Center and do, and organize all of the staff and continue to try and make the staff happy and so forth, I felt like it was going to be a lot of those conversations of problems that weren't problems that would solve themselves and so forth. And I said, nah, I don't really want to be the permanent director because I don't want to spend my time in these kinds of conversations, telling my daughter that her hair would grow. I didn't want to do that professionally. It's fine to do it for my daughter, but and that's really the way I feel about. Somebody has to do those jobs, and hopefully they're people that like them and will do a good job. Often, unfortunately, people take those jobs and because they want the power. But I don't need to worry about that, or I didn't need to worry about that, you know. Uh, but because the other responsibility, if you're going to try and run a business, which a lab is a business, is you got to get money, you got to get grants, and that takes a lot of time too, you know. And so I think those other responsibilities, you have to decide, what you enjoy and what you're good at. And so mostly you're good at the things you enjoy.
That's true.
Awesome. So this is going to be kind of my last question. And I know it looks like we've had to have some folks kind of drop off, but again, if you have any comments or questions that you'd like to have addressed here, please go ahead and add them to the Q&A, and we should have time for them. But my last question is, what are some strategies that you have used to assess the health and effectiveness of your mentor-mentee relationships? So, we've talked, like I said, we've talked a bunch about open communication. We've talked a bunch about the things that, the ingredients that might make a good mentor-mentee relationship, but we are talking about people. So, what strategies have you used to essentially assess that you and your mentor or mentee are on the same page and things are going smoothly?
I mean, I check in regularly, and the longer that you work with someone, you can tell when their behavior changes or when they're kind of frustrated with you. And in those times, I make an extra step to check in and have a chat in my office, or as Ed does, go for coffee and have lunch. I think it's really important to pay attention and listen during those times because there's just no way to avoid them. Things stack up. And every problem that starts small becomes a bigger problem once it's neglected. So I definitely have check-ins. The other thing I've done, as not being the most naturally organized person in the world, I actually have a spreadsheet in the lab that we call our task list. And on that spreadsheet, we actually have tasks that are assigned to each lab member, projected date of completion and when they're completed. And so that keeps me specifically from, trying to micromanage. So they have the freedom, independence to do the task. And if it's not completed on the due date, then I'll check in with them. So I think it's not just addressing a problem as it's happening, it's thinking of ways to prevent the problem from happening in the first place. And so those are kind of two strategies that I've used. So being a bit more organized with a task list and also having a regular check-in with each person in my lab to ensure that things are going smoothly. And thankfully, we have open enough communication, they usually tell me. So I don't have to wonder too much anymore.
I think the fact that we had a regular Thursday morning meeting from 9 to 10:30, we usually use the room from 9 to 11, took care of that by itself, to tell you the truth, Tina. Because everybody was there. If they were, if something came up and there was a reason to, talk to them about what happened, with their research that week, then that took care of that, and so forth. I used to like to say that when my lab was running well, I talked to everybody every day. Okay. I saw them, I checked in with them, or they checked in. Now, there were some people that never came into my office, and there were some people that came into my office every other day. Okay. But, I roamed the lab, or I had reasons to roam the lab. Something wasn't working, something was working, et cetera, et cetera. And I was, as Deb Tusey said in the note that she sent to me when I asked what I did right and wrong, and she said, "You were there." And I was there. Yeah. And so, and the regular meetings were there. There was a lab meeting every Thursday morning. There was beer and chips on Friday afternoon. Uh, there were a lot of group behaviors, and if somebody didn't show up, now I had one person in the lab for 10 years or more that really didn't like the group behaviors. I mean, she came to lab meeting and so forth. She never once came to beer and chips, and she just didn't like that kind of social thing. She wanted to get home to her family, etc. That was okay. I mean, she was great in terms of other things. If you had a paper that you needed read, boy, give it to her, and she always did it. So but she didn't fight the other things. She didn't scorn them or anything like that. She just didn't participate in those things, and so forth. When it was necessary, she did. So I think that sort of thing took care of itself, Tina, to tell you the truth. Maybe I'm fooling myself. Maybe it wasn't all good.
Well,
Uh,
I think,
but
I think,
Lynn did similar things, right? And she had a lab meeting every week, et cetera,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I do the same. I mean, I think the weekly lab meeting is perfect, especially for tasks and ensuring the check-in. But Ed, I realize that I actually talk to each of my lab members every workday too. And so
Yeah.
that's your checks and balance, but that's not going to be the case with every PI. I mean, I've worked with PIs before where I hadn't seen or talked to them for weeks. And so I wasn't sure how they knew what was happening in the lab versus, but they just trusted me. And so that was fine.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
just a very different mentoring style. And so, yeah, Lynn had a weekly check-in, and I do agree that some of these issues were probably mitigated by having that check-in. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
well, and I just want to comment, I think both of you have identified, good strategies. I think you've identified, areas where there has been a difficult conversation or when things may not have, have gone the a way that was mutually beneficial, right? And how to deal with that. So, we do the best that we can do. At least for me, it's like the takeaway themes from our conversation today is, show up, be present, have open communication, set expectations for both the mentor and the mentee side, set boundaries, and find, and I guess you could say this both from the mentor and the mentee perspective, but find the person that you think you could work with. And you don't
Yeah.
necessarily have to have the same style or approach, but if that communication is there, you can navigate that.
Right. And there have been situations for everybody that I know where things didn't work out. And the person stayed in my lab for, 6 months or a year. Okay. And then we mutually parted. And that was sometimes great. I mean, it was good for both of us. Okay. Sometimes I was disappointed that the person left and wondered what I had done wrong. But those happen. So one situation, one mentor is not necessarily uh, perfect for each mentee, and vice versa.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, we're kind of closing in on the end of our session. You both have, I think, provided us with some really useful information. Is there any closing words of wisdom? Again, I'll reach out to the group if there, if you have anything you'd like to add, please feel free to jump on or write something in the chat or the Q&A. But yeah, we'll kind of use these next few moments to wrap things up.
Okay, I will say that I've enjoyed this tremendously, and it's made me think about going back and starting a research career again. But I think it's too late. And,
Yeah, I mean, I just want to echo that again, we're all human. None of us are perfect. I think back when I was a master's student in my audiology program, and we would read papers in our research methods class. And you start to see these names on audiology papers, and you just think, hold these people on a pedestal, not knowing who they are, what they look like. And then I remember going to my first conference, which just happened to be in Havana, Cuba. I was very lucky to go to Cuba in 2005. And I was just watching this group of people having beer, drinking, laughing, and acting like normal people. And then I was like, oh, that's that person in the paper that I wrote, or paper I read, and this is the other one. And, it really kind of hit home that they're just normal people like you. And so don't hold other people on a pedestal. Make sure to speak up, make sure to understand that we're learning along the way. There's plenty of things I look back at and like wish I had done differently, but that's okay. You can change it for the future. So try not to beat up on yourself either. Yeah.
Well, I could say that from my point of view, you're a great colleague. So, and I've enjoyed working with you tremendously. So keep doing the same thing. Maybe
Thanks,
we'll get
Ed.
this clinical trial going.
Yeah, Ed stuck with me for the next 3 years, so you definitely have to say that.
Awesome. Let's see. We have a couple of notes in the chat. Thanks for taking the time to share your thoughts. Appreciate your honesty and the way you care about your team. Thank you, Ed and Angie. This has been time well spent. Another note, this has been very helpful. Thank you for your insights. So lots of positive notes coming through. And again, I want to thank you both for taking the time to donate your time and expertise to our mentoring committee on behalf of our committee, including Lori Dreisbach, who's our co-chair, Dr. Lisa Hunter, who's the president of AAS. I appreciate the effort that you both have put forward for this, and everyone who's attended. So I think everyone is kind of rolling off right now. So we'll officially close it. Thank you again, Ed and Angie, and we'll stay tuned for info on our next mentoring workshop, which is scheduled for January. So more details on that will follow.
And thank you, Tina,
Bye.
and the AAS Mentoring Committee for inviting us. This is great. I do encourage anyone who's left to feel free to reach out to us. I'm happy to talk to anyone further. So thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
See y'all.